I'm Richard and I'm dying. And I thought I'd tell you my story. I work in financial services, and one of my favorite clients, their headquarters is in Brussels. And if you go into the men's toilets in their offices in Brussels, in front of each men's urinal is a sheet of A4. It's laminated for obvious reasons, and it has on it what's called their lessons from the loo. It's basically all the deals that went south where they've lost 20, 30, 40, 50 million, and the lessons that they've learned. So what I'd love to share with you is my lessons from the loo of life when it comes to money. I became a Christian when I was 16. For the first half of my life, first 20 years, God called me to be a professional actor. That didn't involve making a lot of money, you'll be surprised to know. I was taught, give the first 10% to the church and the other 90% you can do with what you want. Actually, we couldn't afford orange juice, we couldn't afford biscuits, didn't amount to much. And then in the late 90s, I was in Japan doing some Shakespeare. I'd been away from home for 5 months, and our third daughter was born, and I cried out to God for a way to earn a living that didn't involve living out of a suitcase. And he very graciously answered my prayer. I was asked, long story cut short, by the chairman of one of the largest companies in the world that I'd never heard of to kind of help him do his speeches and do his communication. And that started a journey of what we and my team do for the last 25 years. Basically, we help people persuade other people to give them hundreds of millions of pounds. And the challenge of that is I would find myself earning in half a day or a day what I had been earning in a week, 2 weeks, a month as an actor. What did I do with that? Well, 10% went to the local church. The rest of it, I'd been told, was mine to do with what I wanted. So what did I do? I looked around my church, I looked around my town where I live. Without even thinking about it, I inflated my lifestyle. What had been holidays in the UK became holidays abroad. What was wool became cashmere. The kids went to private school. We moved house every 5 years because we could, up and up and up the property ladder. And after a while, I felt a deep disquiet that was the right thing to do. And Jesus tells the story about the farmer who has excess at the end of the year and builds barns. Can you remember the word that Jesus uses to describe that farmer? A fool. I was that fool. I came to the conclusion that I was a living embodiment of foolishness. Now, Jesus has some advice, actually, kind of at the back end of that story. He says, be rich towards God. But what did that actually look like? So I started to do some research, and what I found staggered me. If you take evangelical Christians in the world, 20% of them reside in the West. Let's call it North America, Europe, the UK, and 80% reside in the rest of the world. So you've got the wealthy church and the poor church. The wealthy church, evangelical Christians in the West, guess every year what proportion of our income we give away. 2.5%. I came to the somewhat shocking conclusion that I was one of the greediest generations of evangelical Christians ever to inhabit planet Earth. We give our 2.5% to our local churches on the whole. They spend roughly, statistically, 50% on buildings, 25% on a staff team, 10% on missions. Some of that goes abroad. Net, what does that mean? That means for every £100 that God gives to evangelical Christians in the West, 25p goes outside the West, 1/4%. And this didn't strike me as fair. So what was my responsibility to that? I didn't consider myself wealthy. I basically drove a Ford Mondeo estate. I had clients who earned 100 million a year. They were wealthy, I wasn't. And I did the research. Guess how much you have to earn to be in the top 1% of the wealthiest people on the planet? £30,000 a year. I was earning more than £30,000 a year. I was at the top of God's financial pyramid. If God wanted to fund his work around the world, I'd be the first person that he came to. So what did I do? I opened a stewardship account. We upped our giving percentage. And then the question was, well, who do we give to? So at the time, my local church was raising 4 million for a building refurbishment program. And I can remember saying to my vicar, I'm not sure if God had 4 million spare, he'd invest it in that. Now, leaving aside the extraordinary hypocrisy of me saying that, having moved from a perfectly fine 4-bedroom house to the 5-bedroom house that was my doer-upper. Leaving aside that hypocrisy, I still thought that was the right thing to say. So we did support our local church, but also we determined that most of it would go overseas, because that's where the huge opportunity for the gospel is, and that's where the massive needs are. So my clients are very smart investors, and one of their principles are invest in great people doing great things. So that's what I prayed for, great people doing great things. There was a girl in our church. She'd just come back from her gap year. She was 18 years old. She went to Romania, and in her gap year, she found 5- and 7-year-olds sleeping off the streets. So she started an orphanage in her gap year. She wanted money. There was money in our pot, in our stewardship pot. We supported her. Then my business partner took me to Uganda, to an orphanage there. I didn't want to go to Africa, frankly. The idea horrified me, but he dragged me there. He bribed me to go there. And what I found astonished me. I found couples who'd moved into the African bush. This was at the height of the AIDS crisis. Christian couples. And they built a house, and the house had 3 rooms. In the first room, they put 7 beds for the 7 orphan girls they adopted. In the second room, they put another 7 beds for the 7 orphan boys they adopted. In the third room is where they lived. And I suddenly had this epiphany. I'm not part of some irrelevant subculture of Christians in the UK believing weird stuff. I'm part of a global network of inspirational, extraordinary people doing amazing things. And they could do with my help. And I had enough money in the pot to help them. I can remember taking my daughter there, and we went on holiday to one of Uganda's national parks. It's beautiful. And when I was on holiday, I suddenly thought, I wonder if these kids have been on holiday in their own country. And I said to Sam, how much would it cost to actually take these 80 kids and their parents, community of 150 people, on holiday, probably the only holiday of their life, to one of their own national parks? And he gave me the number. Do you know what the number was? It was less than we would spend on a bog standard 2-week holiday in Europe for a family. And there was money in the pot. Jesus said something really interesting about money. He says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be. When I invested in that holiday, it gave me such joy, and it still does to this day. And the more I invested in his kingdom, the more joy I got, more than the joy of a new house, a foreign holiday, whatever it might be. And then somebody said, why don't you meet a man called Eric in Paris? We'll meet at a bistro. Never a hard thing to do, to have a meeting in a Parisian bistro. I went there and I said, Eric, what are you doing? He said, this was the beginning of the 2000s. I want to use the internet to convert the French. Good luck with that. How are you doing that? This was at the beginning of the internet, by the way. So my corporate clients were using the internet, but I hadn't met a Christian who was doing it. He said, I'm converting the gospel into like a 7-minute YouTube video called The Father's Love Letter. I'm then strategically using Google AdWords to draw people to watch it. And when they watch it, they can click on a link if they want to become a Christian. I went, that's smart. So what are you finding in terms of conversion rates? He said, for every 100 people who watch it, 4 people say they want to become a Christian. I went, that's extraordinary. And what's your vision? He said, well, I want to translate it into the other major languages. There are 30 of them. English, Spanish, Farsi, Japanese, Chinese, etc., etc. I went, how much would that cost? He gave me a number. There was money in our pot for it. And I'll tell you, I came out of that meeting and I'll tell you how I felt. Imagine, it's about 20, 30 years ago, you're in Harvard. Next door to you is a strange man called Mark Zuckerberg. And he wanders in one day and he said, I'm going to start this thing. I've got a weird name for it, Facebook, but I need some cash. And if you give me some cash, I'll give you shares in the business. If you knew then what you know now, what would you sell in order to get shares, be the first investor in Facebook? I would sell everything and wander around in underpants for a year. I'd persuade my parents to sell their home, cash in their chips. That's what I felt like. My mind space moved from, oh, what's the minimum percentage I can get away with before God? And what is the most I can get for eternal treasure? Here's what I think. God pays us this is chocolate money. Can you see this? It's what you consume at Christmas. All the money we have this side of heaven is chocolate money. We can consume it, or when we invest it globally in what he's doing, locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, it becomes eternal treasure. And suddenly I was thinking, why should I spend 20 grand on a car when I can buy a old banger for 5 and invest 15 for eternity? Long story cut short, I'll take you to 2005. Our marriage collapsed. I was feeling awful. What was my first response to that? I'll buy myself a holiday home. That'll make me feel better. I like the sea, I like golf, I'll get somewhere there. And then a friend rang me up and said, don't be stupid, Richard, you're self-medicating your pain. There are better things to do with the money. And there were. There's a devotional I love called God Calling. 2 old ladies, about 100 years ago, anonymous. When they prayed, Jesus spoke to them and they wrote down what he said. And every January the 5th, I'd read this. This is what Jesus said to them about money. Don't be afraid of poverty. Let money flow freely. I will let it flow in, but you must let it flow out. I never send money to stagnate, only to those who pass it on. Keep nothing for yourself. Hoard nothing. Only have what you need and use. This is my law of discipleship. I wanted to be brave. I wanted to be braver. I wanted to be like that. I wanted to live without a safety net. So I stopped paying into my pension fund. And I set my lifestyle, and then I determined to give whatever the excess was away to invest it in the kingdom. I wanted to do that, but it was terrifying. Every January, I'd feel the enemy say to me, Richard, because I'm self-employed, at the beginning of a year, my diary's empty. Every January, I'd feel the enemy say to me, you know, this is the year you get found out. You know, this is the year that nobody's going to ring you. And I'd felt Jesus saying to me, will you give me until Christmas, Richard? If you're on a park bench at Christmas, we can have a conversation. For 15 years, I was fearing that park bench, and I've got 15 of these paper diaries in my bedroom to prove that you cannot outgive God, that God meets your needs in every conceivable way. And that for me was really, really exciting to be part of that journey. And then I'll take you to 2014, Christmas Eve. I'm in a hospital in Watford, and a young man who looks like he's about 16, is actually a doctor, comes and kneels down, looks up into my eyes. That's never a good sign, is it? And he says, you've got cancer. We think you've got cancer. On January the 5th, I was with an oncologist and they confirmed it. My cancer was mesothelioma. It comes from asbestos. They reckon it comes from asbestos in old theaters, actually. And it's incurable. And they said, you've got about a year, 18 months to live. At that point, my son, who was in the meeting, had his laptop open. He said, Dad, I found it. I said, what have you found? He said, I found a mesothelioma joke. The oncologist was somewhat surprised. I said, okay, what's the joke? He said, how do you treat a patient with mesothelioma? As best as you can. Anyway, memorable moments. Since then, I've had chemotherapy, 2 big operations, 60 rounds of immunotherapy, 60 rounds of radiotherapy. A couple of months ago, they said the cancer's moved from the right lung to the left lung. It's stopped working, so we're going back to chemo. So I'm in the middle of chemo, so my brain's a fog and I have to sit down. And here's my thought. The closer I get to death, the more grateful I am. Because I'll tell you this, if somebody's got a servant heart, I've got the opposite. I've been awful at talking about my faith to other people. I've been dreadful at inviting people to Alpha or Christianity Explored or whatever it might be. But the fact that Jesus gave me an opportunity to invest some of the money that he's given me in the first place, I mean, don't you find it fairly hysterical that a rather stupid unemployed actor is employed to advise people to persuade other people to give them hundreds of millions of pounds? I find that ludicrous. But the chance to make a difference. We have a cancer club at church. It's not the most popular club, to be fair. I like it. We've lost a few, we've gained a few over the years. One of my friends, Sandra, is dying at the moment. And she said, the closer I get to death, everything drops away apart from 2 things. Love, the love that God has for me, the love that I have for others. And making a difference. Every day, can I make a difference? She coaches from her bed 6 people. She's an extraordinary woman. And I can resonate with that. The chance to make a difference is so important to me. A young man called Ed phoned me up a couple of years ago. He said, we found a people group in India that has no gospel presence at all. And we found 15 Indian evangelists who want to go full time to invest their time in reaching the gospel with them. I went, Ed, how much would that cost? He went, all in all, 15 full-time evangelists, unreached people group, £12,000 a year. £12,000 a year to change the lives of an entire people group. That really excited me. It still does. Let me end with 3 things I'd love to say to you. Do you know if Western evangelicals gave not 2.5%, but 10%, do you know how much more money would flood into the kingdom every year? I'll tell you, 100 billion pounds. That's 100,000 million pounds. That's the same that Putin is pouring into the war in Ukraine. Imagine that as a power for good across the West, across the world. But I'm not asking you to be more generous for that reason. It's for purely selfish reasons. This side of heaven, I've known very few things that give more joy than being a part of what God is doing financially. And in eternity, actually, we get this treasure. What is this treasure? John Lennox, who many of you know is a maths professor at Oxford, lovely Christian man, and he's written a book on what to do when we invest our time and treasure and talent. And he uses the story that Jesus tells of the dodgy steward who used money to buy friends. And he says, when we invest our time and our treasure in what God is doing, we make friends. We make friends. I have friends all over the world by God's grace. And I'm so looking forward to getting to heaven because we're going to sit down and I'm going to hear their stories. And the fact that I've been able to play some tiny, tiny, tiny minuscule part in their stories thrills me now, and I know will thrill me then. I hope that's part of my treasures. One of my great heroes in life is a man called George Muller. For those of you who don't know, George Muller was a Victorian German gentleman who God called to move to Bristol, and God called to look after orphans. And in the course of his life, he looked after 10,000 orphans. He's one of the founding fathers of orphan care in the UK. George Muller's life has 2 extraordinary elements to it. Number 1, he never asked anybody for money, and looking after 10,000 orphans costs a lot of money. The only person he asked was God. Every day he asked God, and God gave him 210 million pounds at today's prices. Now, why could God trust him so much? I think the second thing that makes Muller extraordinary is of the 210 million pounds that God gave him, he gave away to other ministries all across the world 70 million. 1/3 he gave away. Do you know what Muller's legacy is? Because at some time he supported 200 missionaries in China. Muller's legacy isn't just what he's achieved in the UK, it's the growth of the Chinese church. Muller's legacy 150 years later is the 120 million Christians in China who were there because partly of what he funded. So my question to you is, are you not just serving your local communities and your churches, but are you serving the global church? Because Western money can make a huge difference. Let's take the 4 million that we spent on our refurb in our church. If you invested 1 million and you gave it to my friend Ed and a charity called 500K in India. India, you know, has 500,000 villages with no Christian presence at all. 1 million there would support 500 full-time evangelists for 3 years and lead to the planting of between 1,000 and 1,500 churches. If you put 1 million to work in Africa, where so many families live on less than $1 a day, and you gave it to a Christian charity called 5 Talents, you'd actually support 10,000 women, the poorest of the poor, to be able to read and write and count and save and earn their way out of poverty. If you invested 1 million in Bible translation, because we know without the Bible you can't evangelize, and there are still 2 billion people on the planet with no translation of scripture in their heart language. If you invested just 1 million, you'd be able to translate the Bible for a people group of 20 million and make God's story accessible to them. And then if you were really strategic and you decided to use the internet to access the 12 least reached countries in the world, do you know what 1 million would achieve if you gave it to Jesus.net, who are very smart at this stuff? You'd basically, in those 12 countries, enable the gospel to be seen 100 million times, which would lead to 200,000 people indicating that they wanted to come to Christ and to be followed up online. Think of the difference that 4 million can make around the world. The last thing I want to say is this: thank you. Thank you and bless you in everything you have done for his kingdom, in everything you are doing, and in everything you will do. Bless you.